Hi, I'm Clarissa, producer and moderator of the Bulletin. Here's a short clip from one of our segments in this week's episode. Nearly 100,000 California residents remain under evacuation orders for the ongoing wildfires that have consumed large swaths of land in the Los Angeles area over the past week. You've probably seen the footage on the news or social media of the devastation. Neighborhoods totally incinerated, cars and driveways that have been burned out, schools and churches burned to the ground. If you've never lived in wildfire territory, it might be hard to even imagine that all of what you're seeing could be real. I remember living in Washington State a number of years ago during some of the worst wildfire seasons on record and walking out in the morning to see ash covering my car's windshield like it was snow on a winter day. It was just mind-boggling. And for those who are living through the LA fires right now, there is no doubt a sense of otherworldliness to the devastation that's happening right before their eyes. Talking about wildfires is complicated because the topic sits at the intersection of public policy and science and cultural understanding. And so I wanted to call in some expert voices to join us today for this conversation. Joining us to talk more about this is Chief Scientist for the Nature Conservancy and one of CT's 50 Women to Watch, Katharine Hayhoe, and our own Kutter Callaway, Associate Dean of the Center for Advanced Theological Studies at Fuller Theological Seminary and host of the Be Afraid podcast here at CT Media. Katharine, Kutter, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you for having us.
So, Kutter, you live in California pretty near to where the Eaton fire has been burning. I wonder if you could start us off by just describing not just the situation right now, but what it's like to live in a region where the threat of fire is real and present all the time.
Well, it's interesting because you would think that a podcast on horror has nothing to do with this, but one of the episodes of our podcast starts with me re-narrating an event from about 4 years ago where we also had to evacuate. At the time, we lived in Monrovia, which is just a little bit over. Falling ash, as you had described. It was in the middle of the height of the pandemic, so there were lockdowns. Here in Southern California, they had just lifted the air restrictions for the morgues who had to incinerate bodies faster than they normally would. And I remember this moment of going, I don't know what reality is when we were preparing to go to the airport because we'd evacuate, and I see my kids with their tea set. I have 3 daughters, and they were playing tea with the ash on the ground. And that wasn't even the most horrifying moment. The moment was when I actively thought, I really hope that's forest fire ash. And I was like, it shook me awake to go, I don't have the conceptual structure to make sense of what's happening here. Fast forward to, a couple weeks ago, and all of that sort of, I would describe it as trauma, right? Like little t trauma informs and sort of reanimates anytime you hear the warnings, that sort of stuff. But this was just a whole nother level of destruction that normally we don't have. Normally there's evacuations, there's intense smoke, there's, disruption, dislocation for a period of time. But this is the expansiveness of it is, I've never seen anything like it. And we live just a few miles south of where the Eaton fire started, but our kids' school, they lost their schools, and basically all of the, churches, businesses, everything that is there. And that's actually, for me, I'll just speak individually. Our home is fine. It's survived. We've been able to house some folks, so that's a kind of another stress. We've actually got some other kids that can't go back. They had a tent fort sleepover last night. So in the midst of all this, you have, kids playing. But I was struck this time, you see fires like this from a distance, and you do first imagine what would it be to lose my home, which is a very important, devastating thing. I hadn't fully thought through what about losing all of our sort of social infrastructure, our schools, our businesses, and that, I think, with our kids and trying to help them navigate all the friends of the houses they've lost and their schools and where do we go and the memories that we made as a family. At least from where I sit right now, that's been one of the most difficult things to watch as all of that's just overnight basically not here anymore.
Yeah, we think of wildfires as something that happens in arid places like the American West, but it's actually becoming a really big problem across the U.S. Catherine, I saw that research says that 1 in 6 Americans lives in a wildfire area. Florida has almost 50% of its homes now at risk for fire. Places like New Jersey and North Carolina, even here in the Boston area where I live, we had brush fires that lasted for weeks. This is a story about LA, but it isn't. Why is what's happening now in Los Angeles? Why should it matter to me whether or not I live in a Chicago suburb or a southern city or a beachside town on the West Coast?
So back in the 1980s, Americans experienced a billion-dollar weather or climate catastrophe like a wildfire, a hurricane, or a flood about 3 times a year. So 1 every 4 months. Now we are experiencing one every 2 weeks or less. And so we are seeing wildfires, like you just said, not only in California, but across much of the West. I live in Texas. Texas had the worst wildfire on record a year ago last January. I'm from Canada. We had our worst wildfire season on record with smoke that choked the air over much of the U.S. a year ago last summer. But it wasn't just out west, it was out east as well, which you do not think of as a dry, arid place. And on top of that, we have massive heat waves, increased risk of flooding, incredibly strong hurricanes, which we also saw this past year with Helene and Milton. We're just getting hit 1, 2, 3, 4, and that makes us even more vulnerable. All of us, our homes, our lives, our kids, everything we care about is at risk.
Now, we hear things like 18% containment, 11% containment. What does containment mean, Catherine, when it comes to wildfire? And when is a fire officially out?
Containment is different than out, but containment means that the firefighters are starting to get a handle on it. They actually have, it refers to the boundaries of the fire. They can keep it from spreading at that part of the interface. And for a long time, we would check the news, all of us would check the news every morning, and those fires, the Pacific Palisades fire, the Eaton fire, was 0% contained. A big part of that was because of the wind. Yes, California is fire prone, but we have never seen extreme fire risk like this before in January. And when this extreme fire risk occurs during wetter conditions, it's not as dangerous as when it occurs during extremely dry conditions. It's really hard to contain a fire when you've got 70-mile-per-hour winds blowing the sparks further and faster than you can even drive, let alone run. So containment refers to being able to get a handle on it, to start to close it off and then put it out. It's really important. It's something that I don't know how many thousands of people are working on. And it gives us an indication of just how challenging this is, because we're not talking yet about putting it out. We're just talking about containing it.
I think not a lot of people think about, unless you're there in the area, is a couple things. So we had just near us up to, I think, 100-mile-an-hour gusts. So you're talking about not just a fire, but living through a hurricane, essentially. So the damage to my property was all wind-related. We had 100-foot tall trees felled, in our whole backyard, fences are gone. My neighbor, my cars weren't crushed only because my neighbor has taller cars than me. And so, a giant sequoia or something landed on his, and it was hanging above my cars that next morning. So that's one thing. So totally unrelated to the fire, you have the wind. And then afterwards, and Catherine, it'd be really interesting to hear you talk about this too, because then the fire goes and we have scorched earth. So the description of our evacuations a couple years ago happened. And then we did have an unprecedented wet season, which then ran off everything. So we had washed out streets and stuff that were unusable for years and had to be rebuilt. So it's contained now, and then it's afterwards, all of these recurring weather events just amplify each other and make them worse. Even if you get rain, it's like it's a blessing, but it's a curse, that sort of thing.
Well, you're exactly right, Kutter. That is what science shows us, is that what we refer to as weather whiplash is getting worse, and California is really exhibit A. So wherever we live, we have wet and dry, natural patterns of variability in our rain. But what's happening as the world gets warmer is that it's being stretched in both directions. So we're seeing more extreme wet conditions, and in California specifically, the atmospheric rivers are getting much stronger and more intense and dumping a lot more rain on California. There are these rivers of water vapor that come across the Pacific. They pick up all that water from the Pacific, and as they start to rise over the mountains when they hit the West Coast, all the way from British Columbia down to California and Mexico, as they start to rise, they dump all of that water right there. And like you just said, when you've had fire scorching the ground, when all that rain falls, there's no vegetation to capture it, so it runs off and you see tremendous landslides, erosion, and then you see huge growth of invasive species, which tend to thrive a lot more on these extreme conditions. And then when the dry season comes around again, you've got this massive pileup of vegetation that's ready to burn.
Yeah. Russell, as I mentioned at the top of this segment, this is such a multi-layered kind of conversation. And as I was preparing for this, I tapped Rich Perez, who is the host and producer of our new podcast about American cities, This Great and Complicated Place here at CT Media. And he talked to me about something even simple as seemingly simple as a positive feedback loop of people building homes out of inexpensive wood over concrete. And they do this over time in a city, even when spaces that were fire prone, we knew it was a less good choice. And I have always thought of cities as hip, progressive places. I wonder if you could talk to me a little bit about the cultural inertia that exists in cities, because even as we've seen great outpouring of compassion, we're also seeing a lot of criticism in how California has managed its cities and how they've sort of set the stage for a situation like this to occur.
I think it's more than just cultural inertia. I think there's a certain level of human inertia. I mean, if you look at even some of the metaphors that Jesus gives us of building a house on sand and being suddenly unprepared for something terrible to happen, there's something built into us not to see a risk that's not visible to us at the moment. And I actually think in most ways that's a grace, because no one can live in a hypervigilant state of something terrible is about to happen to me all the time. But there have to be those people who do that and who are saying to the rest of us, we have some situations here that under the right conditions are going to be really bad. And I think that's one of the things with the climate discussion that Katharine has engaged in so much. It reminds me a lot of some of the tech discussion, because there seems to be this tipping point from this is never going to be a problem for us to this is such an overwhelming problem, what are you going to do? And it's that there doesn't seem to be that middle space of people who are saying it's a real problem, it's coming, it could potentially hurt us, and we have these actionable steps to take. And that's part of it that's such a, for people who are watching these fires consuming Southern California, the sense of powerlessness, even before you even get to the infinitely worse sense of powerlessness from the people who are in the direct path of the fires, the rest of the world watching this, there's a sense of, well, what can you do? I mean, the comedian Bill Burr was on Jimmy Kimmel the other night blasting people on the internet who are suddenly fire water experts and what have you. Well, part of the reason for that is because people are just watching this and saying, how can something like that happen? I think that plays into what we're facing right now.
Listen to the full episode wherever podcasts are found.